Hi everybody, my name is Liz Deneve and I'm a member of the Secretariat of Kildare Public Participation Network. Thank you so much for joining us on this very rainy Sunday afternoon for an event that is part of Kildare PPN's third annual Climate Action Weekend. This session is one of 17 events which took place over 3 days. We start on Friday and today is our last day. They're a mix of online, in-person and walk and talk events. We are thrilled that many of these events were run, delivered and facilitated by PPN, elected representatives and member organisations. So I'm just going to take a quick minute to tell you a little bit about PPN. Kildare PPN has a membership of 861 community groups from the social inclusion, environmental and community and voluntary sectors within Kildare. There is a public participation network in every local authority in Ireland, and they are funded by the Department of Rural and Community Development, along with funding from their respective local authority, which in our case is, of course, Kildare County Council. Kildare PPN was established to allow communities to have greater involvement with their county councils and to give the community a stronger voice on issues and policies of interest to them. PPN representatives elected by their college sit on all Kildare County Council special policy committees and can influence the work programme and agendas of those SPCs. We know from speaking to member groups that climate and environmental action is crucially important to all member groups, no matter what area they are providing services in. So we're very pleased this weekend to have had contributions from organisations such as Antashka, the SEAI, Codema, Dublin's Energy Agency, County Kildare Chamber, and today we are joined by two senior psychologists with deep expertise in the area of human psychology and the environment. This shows how Kildare PPN can bring expertise into our communities while also highlighting the role that our community groups are already playing and will continue to play in climate action. Which brings us to this afternoon's event on psychology and the climate crisis. We are delighted to have so many registered for this afternoon's session, which I think is evidence of the engagement in our community in the climate and biodiversity crisis, but also the understandable anxiety and I think inertia that people experience around what sometimes feels like an insurmountable challenge. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to today's two speakers. I'm going to start with Dr. Eoin Galavan. Eoin is a senior psychologist working in adult mental health services in North Dublin and senior supervising psychologist and lecturer with the doctorate in clinical psychology from Trinity College Dublin. He is currently the vice chair of the special interest group addressing the climate and environmental emergency with the Psychological Society of Ireland. Eoin is also, he has very strong Kildare credentials and he is on the board of Kerry Farm, a recently established mental health charity located in our Clough County, Kildare. We also have Anne Walsh. Anne has an MSc in psychology, higher diploma in human given psychotherapy, and is currently working towards a PhD in environmental psychology in Maynooth University. She works in private practice as a psychotherapist, previously worked with organisations such as the National Learning Network, Youth Reach, and with businesses in the area of psychoeducation. She's also a member of the special interest group addressing the climate and environmental emergency with the Psychological Society of Ireland. She is a trained shamanic practitioner and explored the area of deep ecology in Schumacher College. And Anne also ran as the Wexford candidate for the Green Party in the 2016 general election. So before I hand over to our two speakers, just a little bit of housekeeping. We'd ask everyone to stay on mute if you could. We have the wonderful Grace Clark in the background manning this session, so she'll keep everyone on mute as well for the moment. We are recording this session and we might take the odd picture, so you might let us know if you have any concerns about that. And we would be very keen to take your questions, so if you could pop them into the chat box, we will do our best to facilitate those questions at the end of each session and then at the end of the overall session. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Eoin. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thanks so much, Liz and Grace and everyone else in the Kildare PPN for organising both today and all the events over the Climate Action Weekend. It's wonderful to see such a kind of robust showing on the issue, and the engagement really does suggest something that we're maybe moving towards those hoped for social tipping points that we hear talked about. Just allow me a moment here to try and share my screen, and God willing, the technology works for me. There we go. Play from start. So I just to share a little bit maybe about my own experience in the issue of climate. I'm not a long-term immersed person in the issue of climate change. Last year around the COP, I started paying more attention. And I've been saying to people, I spent about 20 years trying to not think about climate change, because I'd be eating red meat, driving my car, going on holidays, doing all those things that we've become quite used to as being ordinary and normal. And it would pop into my head, but I'd kind of put it off the psychological shelf. And if you'd asked me, did I know anything about climate change? I would have said, yeah, and I would have given you a pretty good estimation of, the seriousness of it and how, that we needed to change, etc. But yet it wasn't really affecting my behavior or my lifestyle. And I certainly wasn't engaged in kind of climate activism. And I went through this kind of period of paying more attention and started to feel things about it. I started to feel frightened and scared and guilty and upset and unsettled, and stopped sleeping well and started worrying about my kids' future, kind of engaged with it at a very human, personal level. And suddenly it became meaningful and personal to me, and that kind of set me on this journey to getting more engaged. It also opened my eyes to the idea that there is a psychology at play in that journey between inertia and engagement. So I started looking into that, and fortunately there's been quite a lot of work done in this space, so I'm delighted to share a little bit of that with you today. So the question that I've kind of landed on as being central to this kind of dilemma, if you want, is why is it that we're stuck? How is it that we can know, for the most part, you ask people walking down the street, do they know about climate change? They'll give you a pretty good kind of version of it. Ask them if it's serious and they're worried about it. Yes and yes. Right, have you done anything to change your lifestyle or your working practices? Not so much. So why is it that we're stuck? How is it that we can know about this really serious, really troubling, kind of massive issue, and yet stay kind of stuck or kind of mired in inertia and not really doing anything to change? So that's the kind of question I've brought today, if you want. One of the things that I kind of encountered when I started looking into this, I was looking for a chapter in a book. It'd be nice that just tell me about why we're stuck. And of course, psychology isn't like that. It's a very broad field. There's lots of different people, lots of different versions of psychological thinking. So I came across loads of ideas. Here's some of the ideas that we could talk about today that I'm not talking about, or might just bounce off a little bit. The bystander effect, for example, seeing that something's happening, but not doing anything about it. The role of denial. The role of emotion, like I mentioned just a few moments ago. Ideas in behavioral economics, things like temporal discounting, putting things off because it's harder in the future, so we don't take the pain now, we keep the pain till later. Ideas around exceptionalism. Sally Weintraub's book, The Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, wonderful book. Socialization and habitualization, which I've mentioned already, that we've kind of gotten used to ways of living that are really destructive, but because we've gotten used to them, they seem very ordinary. Various cognitive biases we could talk about. The nature of the problem itself, it's slow moving, it's uncertain, it's not happening right now, it's slightly impersonal, it's not particularly immoral, there's no bad guy to really easily point at. All of these issues that various psychologists have pointed at as to why we don't kind of grab our attention onto it. And the role of silence, the fact that we often don't talk about it. And if you want to make a room go quiet, it's not a bad subject to bring up. You can very quickly suck the air out of a conversation by bringing up climate change. So these are all ideas that we could focus on, but I'm not going to focus on today. Some further ideas. I like models. This is a nice way of organizing some ideas and has some value. This is from Per Epson Stonks, who's a Norwegian climate scientist. He talks about the 5 Ds. Psychological distance. It's not me now, it's polar bears in the Antarctic, so I don't have to worry about it. Doomism, it's all terrible, there's no point in thinking about it, we're done anyway, I may as well enjoy the party while it lasts. So we don't have to change our behavior there. Dissonance, this idea that we might care about something, but we become conscious of doing something that is inconsistent with that value system. So I care about my kids' future, but I'm also contributing to this horrible problem called climate change, which threatens their kids' future. How do I resolve that issue? Oh, well, I have a variety of reasons of doing that. Well, Ireland's only a small country and my contribution won't matter much. And it's only one stake, I'm doing less than my neighbor or more than my neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. All these different versions that we have of escaping the dissonance that's created by our consciousness of these things. And then the role of identity. This is a problem that some people care about, but not necessarily me. This is a problem that people who are into green politics care about, for example, but I'm not one of those, so I don't have to care about it. And these are all ways that we have of kind of like distancing ourselves from this issue when information about it comes towards us. And there's a great deal of validity and value in these kinds of ideas because they help shine a light on the way that our minds can work sometimes when we're confronted with knowledge or information about the climate problem. Maybe there's something deeper at play as well, though. Maybe it's in our nature to be selfish, greedy, and destructive, and that there's kind of nothing we can do about it. I've heard people comment on this in a few different ways. Well, it's just human nature to be capitalistic and destructive and, to overconsume and destroy the environment. And I do think we need to be very careful about that narrative, that story that we are somehow inevitably doomed to destroy ourselves. George Monbiot puts it well when he says, we are a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. I like that. Rutger Bregman, in a nice book, characterizes the story of human selfishness as a nocebo, this idea that it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our cynicism about ourselves paralyzes us in despair while temperatures climb unabated. So it's almost a part of that doomism that human beings are doomed to destroy themselves and there's nothing we can do about that. Well, I think we need to be careful with that story. And that's not to say that there aren't elements of truth in it. But another way of thinking about humans, Dalai Lama here, human beings are not intrinsically selfish, which isolates from others. We are essentially social animals who depend on others to meet our needs. We achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress through social interaction. Therefore, having a kind and helpful attitude contributes to our own and others' happiness. In other words, maybe there's another story, the one that tells us about how human beings create health services and charities, public transport systems, and kindnesses of all types every day, connections in family and organizations right across humanity, and has done so for eons. In fact, it's a cornerstone of our prosperity, this cooperation. Claire Kelly, who's an associate professor in Trinity, has written a lovely essay on this called The Stories We Tell and the Stories We're Told. If you want to look a bit deeper into that idea about that version of the human story, one that tells of a cooperative species who can bring ourselves in a different direction. So there's something really important to be conscious of when we're thinking about psychological phenomenon and the climate crisis. Explaining climate change in action as caused by psychological phenomenon inherent in our nature, like the bystander bias or various cognitive biases or temporal discounting or all these other kind of ideas which are useful and valuable in illuminating something. But if we focus on those as causes, it runs the risk of diverting attention from powerful contextual and social factors. Psychological processes are part of climate change in action, but not necessarily its cause. For example, are we really hardwired to ignore this incredibly difficult problem? For the causes of inaction, we must look more broadly into society and at political and economic power, media, culture, our historical context, neoliberalism, capitalism, colonialism, consumerism, being economically hostage to the current set of circumstances we've all been socialized and habituated to live in. In other words, we don't change minds and then move past the barriers to climate action. We work through social, cultural, political, digital media to change minds, to move past the barriers. That context is absolutely critical. In order to get through that context, and in order for people to move from inertia and denial into engaged, positive, constructive, pro-social, cooperative action, which is what we need, one of the psychological phenomena, which I am going to land on for a moment, is the idea of sustaining attention. It's kind of the cornerstone. If we don't sustain attention for a period of time, we don't move. And climate change is a really hard thing to look at for a particularly long period of time. And there's a number of reasons for that. So let's think about that just for a couple of minutes. Why is it that it's so hard for people to keep their attention on the issue of climate change? Could it be something to do with how we are talking to ourselves about this issue? How is it that people can sit and read a book on a sun holiday while the hills are burning behind them? Could it be to do with the way in which, for example, we communicate with ourselves through media? Melting Arctic ice allows greener shipping. Isn't that an interesting frame? Almost as if, hey, look, there's a silver lining to all this melting ice. We can get our ships to go through quicker. This maybe makes it difficult for people to stay engaged because it's kind of confusing. Well, maybe it's not that big a deal. People are pointing at the silver linings. We don't have to be that frightened. We can see all sorts of confusing and clearly kind of vested interested, motivated media reports. These are just a couple from the UK during the summertime. Hottest summer ever. People in bikinis jumping up and down on beaches. Johnson turns his back on the green agenda. Scorchio gets set to swelter like Spain, as if it's going to be a good thing. Isn't that interesting? So when we're confronted with this confusing information, on the one hand, it's a horror story with loss of life, with an overwhelming sense of immense power, with the possibility that we've lost a chance to reverse course. All of these things coming at us. And at the same time, thank God it's Friday. More pictures of people on beaches with ice creams. It's easy to understand why this slips from people's attention and how the way that we're communicating with ourselves about it might be contributing to that. This one from when Dublin Airport opened a new runway. New 320 million runway opens at Dublin Airport with Ryanair flight. Woohoo, growth in progress, right? Happy tears, new airport is opened. Or Dubliners could cut huge amount of emissions by ditching the car for short trips. Which do we pay attention to? Is it possible that the people who are already concerned about climate change might pay attention in a particular way to these things, and people who aren't, who are kind of disengaged or know about it in that kind of slightly intellectual way, but haven't got to caring about it just yet? Take a magazine stand of a variety of magazines, and we have kind of high carbon lifestyle stuff all around that one in the middle that says Parched Planet. Who's going to pay attention to which one? This is some work that's done by George Marshall, who's written a lovely book called Don't Even Think About It. We have to disattend from information in order to survive. It's a way of surviving a busy, information-rich world. So which people, when we're walking down the street, do we pay attention to, and which ones do we not? When we open up our computer screen, which app do we focus in on and which do we not? This capacity to disattend from information is a fundamental part of our everyday psychological lives. And in a way, it can be hijacked by our values, pre-existing beliefs, and what we're looking for. In other words, it's very easy to disattend to information that we don't have a pre-existing reason to attend to. In other words, if you're not caring about climate change, chances are you will ignore the Parched Planet document. If you do, chances are you'll zone in on it. When we see adverts like this, came out last week, Dutch city becomes the first in the world to ban ads for meat. The city of Haarlem will ban most meat ads in public spaces by 2024 because of food's contribution to climate change. Do you think it's good or bad to see this? And what would determine whether you pay attention to it in a particular way or not? Chances are, if you're already in a vegetarian or vegan diet because of climate change, you will be cheering along and saying, thank God people are taking this seriously. It's wonderful to see this. If you're not, you will maybe roll your eyes and say, oh my God, look at this. Isn't it silly? Or just simply disattend and ignore. This kind of confused communication environment allows people disattend when they're not ready or able to engage, or it facilitates that. I want to contrast that with the messaging that came out when COVID first hit. Now, I know COVID's a different creature than climate change, and there are some significant differences in how it could and should be talked about. But at the same time, it was a really big issue that required a huge level of public engagement, a serious threat to our health and well-being, and we needed to do something about it quick. And you could argue that climate change kind of ticks all those boxes now. It was very difficult to disattend to the media message. There was very little equivocation. There was very little confused messaging. In fact, the messaging was actually pretty excellent, I thought. And it was repeated, and it was everywhere. In other words, we all knew exactly what was coming. We all knew what COVID was, and we all knew what we were supposed to do about it in a very short period of time. You were talking a matter of days and weeks to get all of the machinery around this up and running, which was an extraordinary and valuable effort. And yet we're not doing that around climate change. Isn't that interesting? You could make a similar argument around the smoking ban and what we disattend to and what we don't attend to and what we do attend to. I can remember arguing against the smoking ban to my shame and embarrassment looking back all those years ago, a younger person who was a smoker, thinking and saying things like, this will ruin the atmosphere in bars if we get rid of smoke. It's hard to believe I actually believed that at one point. But when I was sitting in a smoky bar when I was younger, I wasn't really paying attention to it. If I went into a bar now and it was full of smoke, I'd be coughing and spluttering and giving out and saying, oh, this is awful. But we all kind of got used to it and we didn't pay attention to it. So isn't that interesting when we have a campaign that pushes something away and then it comes back, you think, oh, that's wrong. It just shows you how habituation and socialization can work. So not only are there things in how our society is communicating and our government's communicating and how we talk around it that are important to help us pay attention and sustain attention, but there are things that happen inside us as well. Arguably, this is one of the most triggering issues that there is in humanity at the moment. There are many ways that people defend themselves in terms of engaging with it, largely because we can. Sometimes, unless you're living, for example, somewhere where a climate shock is happening right now, this happens in those places too, but that's for the sake of discussion. It's easy to say, well, not right now. You know, it makes me feel awful to think about the fact that how much damage has been done and the potential consequences that are coming down the road for my children and our future stability. It makes me feel really terrible, frightened, anxious, upset. And if I don't have any immediate reason to grasp onto that feeling and do something with it now, it slips away. And in a way, over time, we've become kind of habituated and numb to the information, and it stops triggering those anxieties. So what helps us stay with the difficulty? What helps us stay with the trouble on a human interpersonal level? Arguably, the most important thing is the relationships with those people around us. So leaning into conversations. This is why climate conversations are so important, and that we engage in talking with people about climate change. Clear and well summarized information like came at us with COVID, that sense of social cohesion. We're all doing this for each other. Leadership and new social norms, so we know how to regulate and manage our behaviors around carbon. How many flights a year is okay? How much meat a year is okay? Do we have to take extremes? Or is there some kind of version of a middle ground that would keep us in a sustainable space? We need to lean towards the idea of bravery instead of hope. Hope has a kind of passiveness to it, waiting for the hope to come along. Bravery is about leaning towards something that we know is frightening, but we have to do. And all of this needs to happen while we manage our internal worlds so that we keep sustaining our attention. So to sum up, we need to maintain our individual and collective focus on climate change. If we don't, we won't move, we won't change. We need social cues, leadership from government and organizations and every social grouping, in fact, where we work, families, etc., to help us navigate the changes needed to stay with the journey. We need a strong pushback against vested interest controls over social narrative, things like advertising bans on fossil fuels, meat, flying, etc., media education, and being thoughtful about who is interviewed. Climate denial doesn't have a place. We need to push back against an apathetic, hopeless, helpless narrative of the human, selfish human. We need to back ourselves and our capacity for cooperation, creativity, innovation, resilience, bravery, and acting in our collective interests in both mitigation and adaptation, a just transition. And we need to manage our internal worlds to help us sustain attention and stay with the problem, having more climate conversations like this one. So I think we have maybe time for a few questions.
Great.
Happy to take it.
Oh, and thank you for that. I don't think I see any popping in just yet. I don't think I've missed any, but I had a question, if you don't mind. There were two things I was going to say, if that's okay, maybe while people are popping in any more questions. That was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. You reminded me as you were talking, actually, and I just thought it might be interesting just to flag it to anyone maybe who hasn't heard of it, of the recent Michael E. Mann book, The New Climate War, because he talks about the shift from climate deniers to using the other D's: delay, deflection, division, despair, and doomism. And he talks about how, because most people can't really occupy the climate denier space anymore, but they can do lots of other things, you know. But that just, we might pop that into the chat box actually if people haven't read that. A question I had while we're just waiting for a few more to come in is, you know, even as someone who's engaged in the environmental space, I sometimes find myself a bit awkward or embarrassed about bringing it up with people. How do we overcome that, you know, to have those conversations with people, you know?
It's a really interesting question. And there's another question that's come up in a similar space. And I think the idea is the topic is provocative and evocative of lots of different kinds of reactions in different kinds of relationships in different settings. So we need to bring a bit of wisdom about who we're talking to about it and when. It's not always a good time to bring it up. You know, I think that's something that when you're keenly conscious of this, you feel like bringing it up every 10 seconds. You know, every time someone mentions something that is carbon related, it pops into your head and you're kind of looking there going, is anyone going to mention the climate crisis? Sometimes we have to sit on it, and that's wise. It's wise in the context of our personal relationships, as it is with any potentially divisive subject. So people are understandably sensitive to feeling accused or blamed or wronged or shamed in public about what they're doing. So I think we need to be cautious and conscious and thoughtful about that. The way that I found that seems to smooth things into engaged dialogue is, first of all, not to assume that we can change other people's minds. We can't. People change their minds all on their own. So I don't think that my mind is changed by others. And I'm pretty sure if I asked you all, you'd say the same thing. So we have to remember that people get to their changing their own minds. And rather than saying I have to do something to get them to feel or not feel something, I would kind of flip that a little bit and say, I'm offering a person an opportunity to witness my journey into engagement with it. This is how I feel. This is how I got to it. It takes the pressure off a sense of I'm trying to get you to do something or change your mind, and turns it into they can witness your experience and do with that what they can at that point in time. And I found a lot of the time people kind of take that away and they might come back later at a time when it suits them. If there was a quick and easy way to get people to engage and think and talk about it all at the same time, you know, from an individual level. Now, you could argue that if the government was doing and media was doing what happened during COVID, it would be an incredibly different climate to have those conversations, right? So we're having this conversation in a context where there's this blurry kind of mixed message, slightly ambivalent mixed message environment, which means that people can disattend and still assume that that's okay. We haven't had this really clear message, look, this is not okay anymore. We have to change course, and it's everyone taking it seriously all at the same time. We haven't had that. So in the absence of that, we're left with this kind of murkiness and some people being ready for the conversation and others not.
Very interesting. Carolyn actually added in a question which is probably similar to I think what we had just covered was you know, how do you have climate conversations when it causes others so much anxiety, despair that they will change the topic? But I think, Eoin, you gave us a good response to that. Thank you, Carolyn. Mark is asking, how do we change people's attention and what changed yours? It's a good question.
That's a really good question, Mark. I don't think there's a universal answer to it, because I think people will be different. We tend to trust people we know. We tend to trust versions of information that we're familiar with and voices in the media that we're familiar with. So if you were to take a kind of a universal approach to this, you'd probably miss a lot of people. In other words, we need lots of voices talking in lots of ways to lots of different groups with the same coherent content of messaging. What changed my attention was, I think I was primed to thinking about disasters can happen following from COVID. And I was also primed to knowing that society can move on a dime when it has to. And that really struck with me. And when I started reading the information about the COP, it landed with those two things. Terrible things can happen and we can turn on a dime. Suddenly I was able to take the information in. Now that won't happen for everyone, but that was part of my story. It also bounced off kind of a value system I have about being a parent and my kind of feelings about it started to get much stronger because of that. When I started hearing about the timelines that are involved are, years and maybe decades now, instead of it's somewhere out there 2050, we're talking about, we have to have reached the kind of the apex of our carbon usage this year, according to the IPCC, which is now. We have to do something now. So that part of it landed with me. I think there's a lot of things go into that, though. I don't think it's universal.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and thank you for that. Actually, and thanks. I just see Fionnuala Corcoran there has put some really good book ideas there in the chat and she's mentioned the Michael Mann one actually there. Oh, and thank you for that. I think we'll hand over to Anne now, and then just a reminder to everyone, please put questions in. We will come to them. We do want to hear from participants as well, because I think this is a subject that's close to everyone's mind, everyone's heart. So we'll hand over to you now, Anne. Thank you.
Great. And good afternoon, everyone. And thanks again, echoing Eoin's words, to Kildare PPN for organising this. It's great weekend around climate action. And it's great to be sharing the space with you all and Eoin. And I'd just like to acknowledge Eoin's work actually over the last year in putting the voice of psychology into this space, or helping put it in, because, psychology is the study of the human mind, human behaviour. And nothing happens in this world without it first manifesting in someone's mind. So it is really, action when we look, when we look into the human mind and what we are capable of. I came across a very interesting quote lately in a book by Stephen Harding called Animate Earth. And it's nature bats last and owns the stadium. And I certainly hope that we can all bat with and for nature. So here today, I'm exploring the question, is our relationship to the natural world broken? I think frayed is probably a better term. I just feel I can see it being woven back together a little bit more than broken. But I'm going to just start off. I have no slides, so I'm just going to start with a little personal story, and it kind of reflects back to a question I think that Mark put up. But what happened to me personally was I was at a nature connection weekend about 7 or 8 years ago, I think. I became aware, I was always aware of the climate crisis, but I think I became a little bit concerned about it. And it started to hit me about 10 years ago. And then about 7 years ago, I was at a nature connection weekend. And we were told to go out in nature on the Sunday morning and sit there and wait for a message or listen. This was quite a new thing for me. And I was, gosh, what am I going to do? So I sat in this little woodland and I thought, okay, well, if something comes, something comes. And I looked down at the ground and there was an ivy growing along the ground. And I just thought, okay, that's a vine. And I also happened to think it was Sunday morning. Usually a few years ago on a Sunday morning, what would I be doing? I'd be in Mass. And the communion prayer, the work of the vine, the fruit of the vine and the work of human hands came into my head. And I went, that was like an aha moment. It was, we are meant to commune with nature. And it was like, it was so obvious. Now, this is not new at all. I mean, Indigenous cultures and our Celtic ancestors would have told us this all along. And I don't think there's a better example at the moment in Ireland about how nature speaks to us and how we connect with it. If we reflect, what I'm referring to is the ash tree and ash dieback. And the ash tree in Norse mythology is the tree of life. The god Odin formed the first human from the trunk of the ash tree. So I think that's quite a powerful analogy that we have today. But anyhow, I move on. So my area of interest is actually, and what I hope to research in more depth over the next few years, is how deepening that strength of our connection to nature can nurture a more gentle way of living on the earth. So how do we deepen that connection? The most obvious way, and there's a plethora of research around this, is spending more time in what researchers would call green and blue spaces, the woods and the sea. And there is a lot of research to say the more time we spend in nature, the more pro-environmentally we behave. So we tend to develop a respect for nature that offers us a reciprocal relationship. We're better in terms of stewardship. But I think it's really obvious. We all know this is not always the place, or sorry, always the case. Being in the natural world doesn't always mean we're going to take care of it. Eoin showed a very good example actually of the people on the beach and the forest fires behind them. And he had a very good explanation around that. And I was just thinking of, I live very near some lovely beaches. And during the summer, you know, there's lots of rubbish left around. So people are at the sea and they're in the sea, but they're not seeing the sea. And so both our perception of nature and how much the natural world shapes our identity will impact hugely on how lightly we tread on the earth. So how do we perceive nature? Do I see the natural world as an abundant mother who can produce more than enough, quoting Gandhi, for everyone's needs, but not their greeds? Or do I see the natural world as a valuable resource that I can profit from, using its abundance to my advantage? Now, most people I ask that question to place themselves someplace in the middle. And to be honest, it's a pretty tough kind of question to ask people, because we have so many unconscious assumptions around, you know, nature. So it's digging deep into those. And it's the perception of the natural world being an unlimited resource to pillage that has us in the mess we're in today. You know, we're a finite planet, so we can't infinitely grow, as some economists would expect, not all. So Satish Kumar is a wonderful philosopher. I came across him in Schumacher College. He's in his 80s now, and he has this beautiful saying. And he says, he asks this question: are you a tourist on the earth, observing, taking, and moving on, or are you a pilgrim, connecting with reverence and gratitude? I think that's a lovely way of looking at it. Do we travel, you know, do we travel through our lives as tourists or pilgrims? So how we perceive the natural world is influenced unconsciously by loads of different factors. And I'm just going to touch on a few. So how we use language, the economic and political landscape, and our heritage and culture. So if we look at a moment for how we use language, and there's actually a whole, you know, there's a lot of research around this, and there's a beautiful book called Ecolinguistics, and around how language detaches us from the natural world. And I'm just going to take two words here for the moment, or sorry, two terms: food industry and factory farming. So if you think about those two terms for the moment, the food industry and factory farming, what do they hide in respect of animal and human welfare? Overuse of fertilizers, deforestation, pollution of our rivers, all that. So when we delve into these terms and we see what they hide, we can see the merits then of supporting sustainable, ethical, and local food producers, where financially and practically possible, of course. And then if we move on to the economic climate, we actually don't have to move past the word economics. The word economics actually means to manage our ICOS, our home, the planet. And in many cases, economics is detached from ecology, and ecology is the knowledge of our home, our planet. So we have a model where we're managing an economic model where we're managing what we don't understand. So really, our economists basically need to be ecologists. They need to understand what they're managing, at the very least have an understanding of biodiversity. Now, there is some really good work going on in that space. I can think of Kate Raworth, I think her name is, with donut economics, and obviously circular economy. And there's a whole area of economics in the London School of Economics around degrowth. So they're really fascinating areas. So there's a lot of good work being done there. But I just think it's really interesting with language and going back to the root of words, you know. Politically, we live in a capitalist, consumer-driven society where to have more, to consume more, that promise of the product is to be successful. And politicians still measure our wealth in terms of GDP. And GDP is another term that hides the destructive nature of many industries. So this separation from the natural world, it can be traced back for hundreds and hundreds of years. And even like great thinkers like Francis Bacon, I think this is such a scary quote I came across. He's credited with saying, nature once enslaved, takes orders from man and works under his authority. And that just gave me goosebumps when I read it. But on the other hand, there's a good side to this as well. If we live in a culture where the earth is viewed as sacred, or perhaps we align with those values while trying to navigate Western culture, we view nature as fully connected. And we tend to understand the importance of earth, you know, of the trees as our family that produce oxygen, the rivers as thriving living beings that provide water and food, and the earth a place for food, you know, to grow. So American ecologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she wrote a beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. She's half Native American, as far as I know, and she's an ecologist. And she has this beautiful quote in her book, and it's, becoming indigenous to a place means living as if your children's future mattered. So becoming indigenous means living as if your children's future mattered. So looking at how we perceive the world leads to the exploration of how we personally identify with the natural world. You know, an appreciation of our interdependence, apologies. So Leonardo da Vinci said everything in some way is connected to something else, and we can deepen this connection or help it emerge in ourselves and others. So when we reflect on this connection to nature, our commitment to it really deepens. And when I was thinking about this, I'm a very big fan of John Moriarty, the Irish philosopher, and his books are fairly impenetrable, but you get little nuggets out of them. And this is from his translation in one of his books, the Song of Amergin Blungal. Now, Amergin was the great poet of the Milesians who defeated the Tuatha Dé Danann when they came to Ireland. And when he first set foot on the land of Éireann, the first poem that was ever said in Irish, and I'm not going to say it in Irish, my Irish is terrible, was this, and this is just a snippet. I am wind in the sea. I am a sea wave upon the land. I am the roar of ocean. I am the stag of seven fights. I am a hawk on cliff. I am teardrop of the sun. So I think that totally embodies interconnectedness. He's totally immersed in the land there. So we as humans know at a very deep level that everything's connected. We know that, and it's the basic laws of physics. But we've for so long acted contrary to this truth. But we are mighty beings, and where there is life, there is hope, and active hope and bravery, as Eoin spoke about, because I do think hope can be a bit delusional. Somebody mentioned, I think in the comments, Joanna Macy's book, Active Hope, which is beautiful. And there's plenty of life left in all of us. And so really, I suppose to conclude, I would just encourage everybody, I'm sure everybody on this call does this anyhow, but to really reflect on, how they identify with nature and how they perceive nature, and, look at the words we use, the terminology we use, and just maybe go out in nature, think about a place in nature or a plant or an animal that you love or feel connected to. Spend a bit of time there and reflect on the quality of the air, the soil and the water that nurtures that nature being, and how you as a person contribute to the quality of our air, soil and water. Do things like walk barefoot on the land, take a deep breath of good fresh air, and forage. Loads of blackberries in the ditches now. Making teas with hawthorn, washing your face in the dew or a mountain stream. These are all powerful ways of feeling, a sense of belonging to the land. And count your blessings, like look at what we have and cherish it really deeply. And simply do your best with the knowledge you have and the resources you have. And hopefully then we can, travel more like pilgrims on the earth. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was lovely, and lots of lovely chat happening in the chat box there, and big response to the lots of book recommendations actually coming through. We'll have to compile a list to send them on. Just again, if anyone has any specific questions for Anne, then do pop them in. But I was going to ask you, Anne, like, are you generally, like at this moment in time, are you generally optimistic, pessimistic? Where do you think we are in terms of reconnecting with nature, or where, you know, what's your feeling at this point in time about the progress we're making in reconnecting with nature?
I don't think it's fast enough. I don't. I was at a political summer school for 2 days, and it was really interesting. Now, I did miss the environmental event on Thursday, but I decided to shut my mouth and say nothing, like not contribute from the audience, and it wasn't mentioned once. The topic of climate action wasn't mentioned once, and I live in two worlds. I live in a world where I mix with people who are really connected to the natural environment, and then I live in the everyday world where there's not enough of it. But I think it's like Eoin mentioned a book around stories. I think it's telling our own stories and having these conversations. And I know people who have told their own stories have hugely influenced me, and given me ideas, given me ideas of what to do and where to go. And I mean, sometimes it can sound a bit like, oh, airy fairy or trite, go out and make tea out of hawthorn. But then you start to learn about hawthorn and the powers of it and what the hawthorn berry does for blood pressure or whatever, and you read a bit around the science of it. And you start to get a deeper, appreciation for it. So, it is, sorry, going back to your question, is I am hopeful, right, in the sense that absolutely, I think we are all altruistic human beings. We are not selfish beings. I don't agree with Darwin and the selfish gene. I think I think she was a sociologist, and she basically said, the first evidence of human empathy was they found a skeleton, and somebody had tried to fuse the bone back. Somebody had broken their leg or something. I have this a bit not quite right, but basically there was evidence that hundreds of thousands of years ago somebody had tried to heal someone's broken leg. Yes. So yeah, that's in us, and it's up to us. But I do think it's a political journey, but it's a very personal journey as well. And I would like our politicians to be out connecting with nature, and our CEOs, and so it's a personal thing and it's a political thing, and there is hope, but we all have to keep pushing on with it.
Yeah. Just a question that was put to Eoin, so I'll put the same to you. And I note that it's interesting to see that you obviously, when you ran for the Green Party in 2016, you've obviously been thinking about this space for a long time. But what was the moment that brought you to, I suppose, what we call general environmental activism, or whatever that might look like? What was that moment for you that turned your attention to that?
I think one of them was that thing I said about what happened to me, where it was like, oh, to be in communion with nature. It was like an aha moment. It was like, oh, and I know I had another experience where I felt I just felt very profoundly the pain of all the animals. It just hit me like a ton of bricks. It was like, oh my God, these animals suffer. They suffer. And then I just started to join the dots, I suppose. And I thought, what can I do? And at the time I was in the Green Party, and I was asked to work in Wexford, and it was like, well, there's nobody else going to do it. So it was actually that. So yeah, it's that being of service. And I think there's the Kogi Indians in South America. It's like, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it was like, their understanding is, from the minute you're born, you're here to serve. You're here to serve the land and protect the land, protect all living beings. So I think it's when you start to look at other philosophies beyond Western philosophy, I think that's really important as well.